Hello and welcome back. We are now looking at the last passage of practice test 1, so congratulations on getting this far. You've done 4 passages. You should be really proud of yourself for making it this far. And now what you'll realize on this last passage is that there are actually 2 separate passages. It's the double passage. We knew this was going to happen, and you should count on this happening when you actually take the SAT yourself a few months down the line, or a few weeks or days, or however long it is before you take the next exam. I do want to remind you that even though we have 2 passages, the total length of the passage is not any longer than what we are accustomed to. You can see that we have about 88 lines, 89 lines, which is the normal amount. So don't panic. What's our plan for reading the double passage? Very simple. We are going to read the first passage in its entirety, then go answer all the questions we can using passage 1. We'll come back, read passage 2, and do the same exact thing. Read all of passage 2, answer all the questions. Lastly, there are those types of questions that require you to have knowledge of both passages. They're comparison/contrast questions, and then we'll wrap up with those questions and to be done with this passage. Now, as far as reading the excerpt for the science passage, we have already talked about it not being as useful. So just a quick reminder, when you're reading the excerpt for the science passages, the author's name, really any passage, the author's name is not relevant. We don't care about the publishing company nor the year the article was published. Really here, what might be useful for these excerpts is just the titles of each passage. And next, we are going to be skimming and annotating. So again, don't focus so much more on how I'm annotating. Focus on what it is that we look out for when we are annotating. And without further ado, we can begin by reading this first passage. But first, the excerpt for it is Space Mining, the Next Gold Rush. It's the question mark. That's the title of passage 1. And the title for passage 2 is Taming the Final Frontier. So let's read passage 1 and answer all the questions we can. Follow the money and you will end up in space. That's the message from a first of its kind forum on mining beyond Earth. Convened in Sydney by the Australian Centre for Space Engineering Research, the event brought together mining companies, robotics experts, lunar scientists, and government agencies that are all working to make space mining a reality. So, as far as annotating is concerned for this passage right here, this first 2 paragraphs that we've read, it sounds like there's a big meeting happening about space mining. So I'm just going to write meeting, and then we go on. The forum comes hot on the heels of the 2012 unveiling of 2 private asteroid mining firms. Planetary Resources of Washington says it will launch its first prospecting telescopes in 2 years, while Deep Space Industries of Virginia hopes to be harvesting metals from asteroids by 2020. Another commercial venture that sprung up in 2012, Golden Spike, Colorado, will be offering trips to the moon, including to potential lunar miners. So it sounds like there are several companies interested in entering the business. We have 2 private asteroid mining firms. First one is Planetary Resources, and they want to launch telescopes in 2 years. We have Deep Space Industries, second company, and the third one, Golden Spike of Colorado. All that these have in common is that they are all interested in space mining. Let's read on. Within a few decades, these firms may be meeting earthly demands for precious metals, such as platinum and gold, and the rare earth elements vital for personal electronics, such as yttrium and lanthanum. But like the gold rush pioneers who transformed the western United States, the first space miners wouldn't just enrich themselves. They also hoped to build an off-planet economy free of any bonds with Earth, in which the materials extracted from and processed from the moon and asteroids are delivered for space-based projects. So here we see a similarity. Remember, when you're annotating, keep an eye for similarities and differences. Here we see a comparison, but like the gold rush pioneers who transformed the western United States. Within a few decades, these firms could be meeting earthly demands. So they might be meeting earthly demands. So we know where to go find it. And it says, but like the gold rush pioneers, they don't want to just enrich themselves. So here I'm going to say they will be altruistic. They also hope to build an off-planet economy free of any bonds with Earth, in which the materials extracted, processed from the moon and asteroids are delivered for space-based projects. Okay, so let's go on. In this scenario, water mined from other worlds could become the most desired commodity. In the desert, what's worth more? A kilogram of gold or a kilogram of water? Ask Chris Zachney of Honeybee Robotics in New York. Gold is useless. Water will let you live. So here, the question is, what's more important in space? Is it water or gold? I'm drawing a droplet. This is a droplet of water because water will give you life. Without water, you can't live. That's what that's saying. So let's read on. Water ice from the moon's poles could be sent to astronauts on the International Space Station for drinking or as a radiation shield. So here they talks about the uses of water in space. Uses of water. Again, I'm going to use a droplet for water. Splitting water into oxygen and hydrogen makes spacecraft fuel. So ice-rich asteroids will become interplanetary refueling stations. All right, so I guess this is still emphasizing the importance of water. So this is all about how water could be used in space. Keep going. Companies are eyeing the iron, silicon, and aluminum in lunar soils and asteroids, which could be used in 3D printers to make spare parts or machinery. Others want to turn space dirt into concrete for landing pads, shelters, and roads. These are the benefits of stuff that's mined from outer space. Materials or resources, we can say, and how they can be used. All right, now that completes passage 1. Let's go ahead and try to answer the questions from this first passage. Question 42. In lines 9 through 17, the author of passage 1 mentions several companies primarily to do what? Again, I invite you to try to answer this question on your own before coming back and seeing if you got the answer right. Okay, so if you remember, we annotated something about this. Actually, it caught our attention because we said there are these 3 companies that are being mentioned in connection with their growing interest in space mining. There was this one, and the third one's right here. So yes, it seems like there's a race to take advantage of the resources that can be found in outer space. So with that said, we have an answer that we just came up with. Let's see if what we are thinking is going to be one of these 4 choices. Okay, choice A, note the technological advances that make space mining possible. Well, mentioning companies would not accomplish that, so A would not make sense. The reason why they were mentioned, okay, let's look at choice B. Provide evidence of the growing interest in space mining. That is what we have. That's our answer that we came up with, so we'll leave that open, see if there's anything better. Emphasize the large profits to be made from space mining. Sure, but there's nothing about profits in here. I think that the main idea here is that there's growing interest in space mining, so not so much C. Let's look at D. Highlight the diverse ways to carry out space mining operations. So D is out. Notice the pattern here. Like almost every question we've ever looked at has 2 clearly wrong answers, and we are usually down to 2 choices that sound kind of similar. Now remember, the way to break the tie between these 2 questions is the answer will always be in the passage. If it's not in the passage, it is not the answer. So this choice here, choice C, mentions large profits. That was never mentioned at all in the passage, so that has to go away, and that leaves B as the answer to this question. Okay, let's go on to the next question, question 43. So the author of passage 1 indicates that space mining could have which positive effect? And I think we saw something about positivity and all the benefits we can reap from space mining right around this region. Because we said meeting demands is what we annotated. And that's where all the wonderful things we can get from space were listed. So let's read. Within a few decades, these firms may be meeting earthly demands for precious metals such as platinum and gold, and the rare earth elements vital for personal electronics such as yttrium and lanthanum. So that's what we're thinking the answer is. We're still applying the my answer strategy. Let's see if there's anything in alignment with that. So positive effects. It could yield materials that are important to Earth's economy. Actually, that sounds like it's it. B says it could raise the value of some precious metals on Earth. That was never mentioned. It could create unanticipated technological innovations. That was never said. It could change scientists' understanding of space resources. That was never said, so it's got to be A. And that brings us to the next question. Which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? Thankfully, we already know where we found this. It was right around this region. And those are lines 17-ish through 20-something. And that appears to be A. So yeah, that would be it. And that brings us to the next question, question 45. As used in line 19, demands most nearly means what? So this is a vocabulary in text question. Let's go to line 19 and find it. Within a few decades, these firms may be meeting earthly demands for precious metals such as platinum and gold. So this is like supply and demand type of demand. So let's go ahead and look at the choices. Offers, claims, inquiries, or desires. And I think desires would be a demand. Like there's a demand for a certain good to be supplied to the market. There's a desire for it. People want to buy it. So D would have to be the correct answer for this one. All right, and that brings us to the next question, question 46. What function does the discussion of water in lines 35 through 40 serve in passage 1? So the discussion of water, as we noted it, was right in this region, 35 through 40, and they actually told us to look there. Why did the author put that there? What's the function of that? So let's read it. Water ice from the moon's poles could be sent to astronauts on the International Space Station for drinking or as a radiation shield. Splitting water into oxygen and hydrogen makes spacecraft fuel, so ice-rich asteroids could become interplanetary refueling stations. So it sounds like these are various uses of water. So let's actually look at the choices and see if there's anything that's going to say that. It continues the extended comparison that begins in the previous paragraph. It's not a comparison, so A would not make sense. It provides an unexpected answer to a question raised in the previous paragraph. No, the answer was actually answered, so that's not it. It offers hypothetical examples supporting a claim made in the previous paragraph. And last is it examines possible outcomes of a proposal put forth in the previous paragraph. So C and D, again, down to two choices. C is saying it offers a hypothetical example supporting a claim made in the previous paragraph. What was this claim? That water is definitely more useful in space than gold is. And I think this is giving examples of that. So that actually makes sense in that we can use water as a radiation shield. And it could be used for drinking, obviously, and it could also be converted into fuel for spacecrafts. So C would have to be it for this question. And that brings us to the next question, question 47. The central claim of passage 2 is that space mining has positive potential, but, and here you see we've exhausted the questions for passage 1. That's not to say that there couldn't be more questions on passage 1 later on, but this question is asking about passage 2, and this would be a great time to go back and read passage 2. So let's do that. The motivation for deep space travel is shifting from discovery to economics. The past year has seen a flurry of proposals aimed at bringing celestial riches down to Earth. No doubt this will make a few billionaires even wealthier, but we all stand to gain. The mineral bounty and spin-off technologies could enrich us all. As far as annotating is concerned, it sounds like, again, there's an increase, there's a spike in interest, and this has happened within the past year. So that's common. They have that in common, the first two passages. And then what's slightly interesting here is, sure that people will get richer from all the resources that come from space, but there's a quick note here that all people stand to gain. The mineral bounty and spin-off technologies could enrich us all. So it sounds like, everyone's benefit. So I'm going to make a note here, like all need to benefit. This author is proposing that everyone needs to benefit. Next. But before the miners start firing up their rockets, we should pause for thought. At first glance, space mining seems to sidestep most environmental concerns. There is probably no life on the asteroid, and thus no habitats to trash. But its consequences, both here and on Earth and in space, merit careful consideration. This is interesting. So while this second author is all for going to space and mining, he's a little bit more cautious than the first author. He's saying we should pause for thought. He's asking us to think carefully. So here is a caution to be careful before going out there to space and just starting our expeditions, because there could be life in outer space that we may not be aware of. Okay, let's go to the next paragraph. Part of this is about principles. Some will argue that space's magnificent desolation is not ours to despoil, just as they argue that our own planet's poles should remain pristine. Others will suggest that glutting ourselves on space's riches is not an acceptable alternative to developing more sustainable ways of earthly life. And so the author continues to make the case that we should be careful before just going to outer space and starting to despoil, or rather just take resources from out there. All right, so this is an argument. So again, it's just an expounding of what was said earlier about being careful. So let's read on. History suggests that those will be hard lines to hold, and it may be difficult to persuade the publics that such barren environments are worth preserving. After all, they exist in vast abundance, and even fewer people will experience them than have walked through Antarctica's icy landscape. So it sounds like this author is saying, yes, we need to think, but this might be a tough sell. Telling people to just hold their horses. Let's pick up from line 73. There's also the emerging off-world economy to consider. The resources that are valuable in orbit and beyond may be very different to those we prize on Earth. Questions of their stewardship have barely been broached, and the relevant legal and regulatory framework is fragmentary, to put it mildly. In this paragraph here, it sounds like this author is saying something similar to what passage 1 said. There's also an emerging off-world economy to consider, and here's the key. The resources that are valuable in orbit and beyond may be very different to those we prize on Earth. Questions of their stewardship have barely been broached. And this reminds us of what the author in passage 1 was saying. There was a question about water being more valuable on Earth or in space. And we saw, gold versus water in space, what's more valuable? Water was it. So let's go on and read from line 79. Space miners, like their earthly counterparts, are often reluctant to engage with such questions. One speaker at last week's space mining forum in Sydney, Australia, concluded with a plea that regulation should be avoided. So one person was saying that regulation should be avoided, but miners have much to gain from a broad agreement or on the for-profit exploitation of space. So this author does want regulation. He is for regulation. And he goes on, and actually that's mentioned up here also. Without consensus, claims will be disputed, investments risky, and the gains made insecure. It is, in all of our long-term interests to seek one out. To seek what out? Seek one out is seek an agreement, a consensus on how we're going to go off and exploit space. So having read all the lines from passage 2, we're now ready to try to answer these questions. So back to question 47. The central claim of passage 2 is that space mining has positive potential, but it will end up encouraging humanity's reckless treatment of the environment. Maybe there was a lot of caution, so let's just pause for thought. Let's read all the other choices first. Its effects should be thoughtfully considered before it becomes a reality. Yeah, that's actually more accurate than A is. Thoughtfully considered before it becomes a reality was a recurring theme from passage 2. We annotated several times. We annotated careful here and careful here. So I really like B. Let's look at the other ones just to make sure. Such potential may not include replenishing key resources that are disappearing on Earth. That was not the main claim of passage 2, so C doesn't make sense. Experts disagree about the commercial viability of the discoveries it could yield. That's also not true, so it's got to be B. And A is not making as much sense as B is. So let's go to the next question, question 48. As used in line 68, hold most nearly means what? Here's another vocabulary in context question, line 68. History suggests that those will be hard lines to hold, and it may be difficult to persuade the public that such barren environments are worth preserving. So hard lines to hold, to maintain, to withstand. Holding something would be maintain. Actually, maintain is one of the choices in here. So yeah, those will be hard lines to maintain. And this was in connected to trying to convince people that they ought to be careful. And those are tough lines to hold. So yeah, that would be A. Grip doesn't make sense. Restrain doesn't make sense. Withstand doesn't make sense. Let's go to 49. Which statement best describes the relationship between the two passages? Let's go through the choices. Passage 2 refutes the central claim advanced in passage 1. I don't believe that's it. I think both authors agreed that mining is useful. The only difference between these two is that the first one was not really talking about regulation or thoughtfulness or being careful, while the second one is. So I don't think they were refuting one another. They agree that space mining is a way of the future. So A does not make sense. Choice B. Passage 2 illustrates the phenomenon described in more general terms in passage 1. No, they're actually saying the same thing. quite on the same level. I don't think B makes any sense, so we can eliminate that one. Passage 2, this is choice C. Passage 2 argues against the practicality of the proposals put forth in passage 1. Now that's seemingly closer to the truth. Passage 2 argues against the practicality of the proposals put forth in passage 1. Now, did they argue against the practicality? Maybe. Let's look at D first before we make a decision. Passage 2 expresses reservations about developments discussed in passage 1. Actually, D would have to be it. Once again, notice that we eliminated 2 clearly wrong answers and we're down to 2 choices again. Again, how do you make sure you pick the right one? It's got to come directly from the passage, all right? So we know that D is what happened. There were reservations about the developments discussed in passage 1, because passage 1 was saying, let's go do it now. Let's go mining. Let's get all the resources that we can. And passage 2 saying, yes, great, let's do that, but let's be careful. So that's reservation right there. And that means C is not it. So we can move on to the next question. The author of passage 2 would most likely respond to the discussion of the future of space mining in lines 18 to 28, passage 1, by claiming that such a future. So we have to really understand what this question is asking. It says the author of passage 2 would most likely respond to the discussion of the future of space mining in lines 18 through 28 from passage 1 by claiming that such a future blank. So we want to go to passage 1, lines 18 through 28, which are starting here, ending right here. Let's read that. Within a few decades, these firms may be meeting earthly demands for precious metals such as platinum and gold, and the rare earth elements vital for personal electronics such as yttrium and lanthanum. But like the gold rush pioneers who transformed the western United States, the first space miners wouldn't just enrich themselves. They also hoped to build an off-planet economy free of any bonds with Earth, in which the materials extracted and processed from the moon and asteroids are delivered for space-based projects. What would the author of passage 2 say about that statement or that paragraph? So let's go through the choices real quick. The author of passage 2 would most likely say, the future is inconsistent with the sustainable use of space resources. That's choice A. There's nothing about sustainability, so let's maybe hold that off for now. Will be difficult to bring about in the absence of regulations. That actually sounds very accurate. Passage 2, the author of passage 2, talked about regulation several times, and we see that in this region. We see regulation right in here, and we see regulation right in here. So yes, I think B would have to be the correct answer. But let's look at C and D. Cannot be attained without technologies that do not yet exist. So it's not about technologies that don't. This was not about technology, so C would not make sense. Seems certain to affect Earth's economy in a negative way. Nope, they don't agree on that. So A and B were the 2 choices. B, C, and D were the obviously wrong ones, and we go with B because it's about regulation, and regulation is talked about in the passage. That brings us to the next question, question 51. Which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? All right, let's go through the choices. Line 60 through 63 is too high up, so we know that it can't be that. It cannot be 60 through 63. 74 through 76 is right around where we started talking about regulation in this region right here. But is 74 through 76 the exact line that we need? Let's see. The resources that are available in orbit and beyond may be very different to those we prize on Earth. Doesn't even talk about regulation at all, so B would not be it. 81 through 83, let's look there. 81 through 83 says, one speaker at last week's space mining forum in Sydney, Australia concluded with a plea that regulation should be avoided. Well, that's actually the opposite of what we're looking for. We want regulation, so C cannot be it. And hopefully D is it. Let's read it. 85 through 87 says, without consensus, claims will be undisputed, investments risky, and the gains made insecure. That's it. That's about regulation right there. So D has to be it. And that brings us to the last question of passage 5. Which point about the resources that will be highly valued in space is implicit in passage 1 and explicit in passage 2? So let's go through those choices. Choice A says, they may be different resources from those that are valuable on Earth. That was literally said in passage 2. And we can find it. Let's see if we can locate it. Passage 2 says, yeah, right here. The resources that are valuable in orbit and beyond may be very different to those we prize on Earth. So that was explicit. Now, was it implicit in passage 1? Did they literally say anything about that? They kind of like coded it, honestly. And it was coded in this region. What would be the more desirable commodity in the desert? Would gold or water be worth more? Well, I guess water would be worth more in the desert. So yeah, I think A makes a whole lot of sense, but we can't really make a final decision until we look at the other choices. So let's go and look at B. They will be valuable only if they can be harvested cheaply. Not really. That price and cost of harvesting was never mentioned in either passage. They are likely to be primary precious metals and rare earth elements. I believe passage 1 was very explicit in mentioning the actual metals. It mentioned lanthanum, yttrium, platinum, and gold. Passage 2 did no such thing. Well, this question here wants us to be explicit in passage 2 and implicit in passage 1, so C would not make sense. Let's look at D. They may increase in value as those same resources become rare on Earth. That was not mentioned in either passage, so that leaves A as the best answer to that question. So, great job, everyone. We have come to the end of this passage, and effectively, we have come to the end of the reading section of practice test 1. So what's going to take place from now on is that you're going to keep practicing. There are 9 other free tests out there for you. And thankfully, we had enough time to go every type of passage that you will see. Of course, it's not going to be the same exact passage, but the style is the same, and the approach that we have shared with you today will carry you through the rest of these passages. So if you find yourself forgetting on what needs to be done, feel free to come back and watch any of these 5 different types of passages and think about how we were annotating. Think about the things that we were looking for in each passage. These tests, again, are very, very similar in structure, and they're very similar in the way they ask those questions. So if you do enough tests, you will not be fazed by any future exams. And that's the goal, to get you comfortable and confident enough to take this exam under pressure and do well. So great job on finishing this section. I will see you on the next one.